She was 9 years old the first time Harlan Voss looked through her. Her mother, Della, had been cleaning his house for 6 years by then. 6 years of Mondays and Thursdays, 6 years of the service entrance on the left side of the house, 6 years of parking her second-hand Buick in the alley and walking up the flagstone path with her caddy of supplies in one hand and her good morning ready. 6 years of scrubbing his bathrooms and pressing the creases out of his good tablecloths and refilling the lemon verbena soap dispenser in the powder room that no one ever used. Della did not complain. Della did not ask for more than she was owed. She showed up, she worked, and she went home. And what that home looked like was something he never once thought to wonder about. The day he looked through Renee was a Thursday in October. Della had brought her daughter because the school district had a staff development day, and there was no one to watch her. Renee sat at the kitchen table with a library book open in front of her, careful not to touch anything, the way her mother had told her. She was reading a book about the planets. She had already finished it twice. He came in for a glass of water. He noticed the child the way he might have noticed a chair left in an unusual position. He asked Della who she was, and Della said, "My daughter, sir. She won't be any trouble." He looked at Renee then, a single slow survey that started at her worn sneakers and ended somewhere above her forehead, as if the information wasn't worth storing. Then he said, in the tone of a man sharing a self-evident truth, "Children like that never amount to anything. You do better not to give her ideas." He poured his water and left. Della didn't say anything. She kept her back to the doorway and kept moving the sponge in slow circles across the counter, and Renee watched her mother's shoulder blades go rigid under her uniform shirt, and then, slowly, release. That was the whole of it. No argument, no scene, just a woman absorbing another small cruelty and going back to work, because the rent was due in 11 days. Renee closed her book about the planets and looked at the window over the sink where the October light came in pale and flat, and she made a decision. She did not frame it in words. She was 9. But something settled in her chest that morning that never fully left, a quiet and absolute refusal, and she carried it home on the bus with her mother that afternoon, like a stone she intended to build something from. If you have ever watched someone you love absorb a cruelty in silence because they had no other choice, then you already know what that bus ride felt like. If you haven't, stay with this story, because what he said to that little girl in his kitchen did not end her. It started something he would spend the rest of his professional life trying to understand, how he never saw coming. Della Watkins grew up in a city she loved, and a neighbourhood that the rest of the city had long since stopped seeing. She was the youngest of 5 children, raised by a woman who cleaned offices at night and a man who drove a delivery truck until his back gave out. She had wanted to be a nurse. She had the aptitude for it. She had the patience, the precision, the care. She had completed 1 year of nursing school before her mother got sick, and then the money that had been tuition became rent, and nursing school became something that lived in the back of her mind, like a photograph she kept in a drawer. She had married at 24, a man named Curtis, who was gentle and funny, and who loved her daughter from the day she was born. Curtis drove a city bus. Between his route and Della's cleaning jobs, they kept a 2-bedroom apartment in a complex off the main boulevard, where the hallways smelled of other people's dinners and the radiators knocked through the winter nights. They were not rich. They were not struggling in the way that makes headlines. They were paying for everything with everything they had and doing it steadily, and that steadiness was its own kind of dignity. Renee grew up inside that steadiness. She understood, before she had words for it, that her mother was brilliant and her mother was unseen, and that those two things had been made to coexist by a world that did not pay for brilliance when it came in Della's particular wrapping. She understood it the way a child understands weather, not as a philosophical proposition, but as a physical fact you plan your life around. She was a serious student, not the kind that chased approval, but the kind that wanted to know things so badly it felt like hunger. She stayed after school to ask questions her teachers weren't always prepared to answer. She checked books out of the library in stacks of 4 and read them in order. She finished high school second in her class. She got a scholarship to a state university when she was 17, the first in the Watkins family, and she sat at the kitchen table the night the letter came and watched her mother read it 3 times. And when Della finally looked up, she was pressing both hands flat against the table as if she needed something to hold. "You see?" her mother said, and those were the only 2 words she offered. Renee knew exactly what they meant. She studied finance at school, then business strategy, then something she couldn't have named for you in a single sentence, but that had to do with understanding how organizations work and where they break and how to make them do something different. She was sharp and she was quiet about it, the way her mother had been quiet, not hiding but not announcing, letting the work speak because the work was what she could control. She graduated in the top 4% of her class. She had one dress for interviews. She wore it 7 times that spring with a different scarf each time. Her first job was as an analyst at a mid-sized consulting firm downtown. She was one of 3 women in her department, and one of the things she learned quickly was that the room did not adjust itself for her the way it seemed to adjust for some of the men in her cohort. She learned to speak a beat earlier than felt natural. She learned to put a number in front of everything, because numbers had a quality of authority that her voice alone was sometimes not granted. She worked late and she worked early, and she submitted her analyses on time, and then ahead of time, and then with annotations. And she made herself indispensable, not because she needed to, but because she understood from watching her mother that being indispensable was one of the only protections available to the people the room was not built for. She was good at it. She was genuinely good at the work itself, and over time, that goodness accumulated into a reputation, which is a slow currency but durable. Her second job was a senior position at a larger firm. She was hired for her analytical skill and quickly found that what she was actually useful for was the part that came after analysis. The conversation that happened when you brought unwelcome information to people who did not want to hear it. She had a talent for that conversation. She knew how to enter a room with bad news and leave it with everyone still at the table and willing to work. She didn't know exactly where she had learned this. She thought sometimes that she had learned it at a bus stop, watching her mother count quarters before the next route came. There was a particular engagement in her 3rd year at the firm, a mid-sized manufacturing company in the city's outer ring that she kept returning to in her mind for years afterward. The company had a liquidity problem that the leadership did not yet know how to admit they had. Renee had been sent out with a junior analyst named Phelan, a nervous young man who kept his notes color-coded and thought the way to manage difficult news was to bury it in qualifications. She had told him on the drive out, "Put everything in plain sentences. If they have to translate what you said, you haven't said it." He had looked at her like she'd handed him something without explaining what it was. The meeting was in a conference room that smelled of carpet cleaner and old coffee. There were 7 people across the table from her, including the company's founder, a man in his late 60s named Reeves, who had built the operation himself and did not enjoy being told what it looked like from the outside. Renee had laid out the findings in sequence cleanly with no apologetic hedging, and when she reached the core number, the one that meant they needed to make decisions in the next 90 days rather than the next 18 months, Reeves had put his hand flat on the table. "Young lady," he said, in the voice of a man accustomed to that phrase doing work. She had looked at him steadily. She had set her pen down. She had said, "Mr. Reeves, I am telling you what the numbers say. What you do with that is your authority and yours alone. But you brought us in so that someone could tell you the truth, and the truth is what I'm giving you." Nobody in the room said anything for a moment. Then Reeves had picked up her report and looked at the page she'd been referencing, and he had said, "All right, walk me through it again." She thought about that room sometimes when she was in difficult meetings. She thought about how much of the work was simply being willing to stay in a room where the air had gotten heavy and to speak clearly into it. Her mother had done this every day of her working life. Della had walked into other people's houses and done the hard and invisible labour with a steady hand and come home. Renee had walked into other people's problems and done the same. The setting was different. The skill was the same. Her 3rd job was a vice presidency. Each step took 5 years or less, which is faster than most people make it, and slower than the people who like to pretend the path is simple. She made friends, and she made enemies, and she made decisions that sometimes kept her awake at night, and she developed a particular skill for walking into a room where no one expected her, and making the room rearrange itself around the fact of her. She did not do this with theatre. She did it with preparation and a very particular quality of stillness that people who worked with her said was the thing they noticed first and remembered longest. There was one afternoon, when she was 34, that she thought of often. She had been presenting a projected operational restructure to a board that had seemed comfortable before she entered and had become incrementally less so as she spoke. One of the members, a man named Bricker who wore his suits like armour, had interrupted her twice with questions that were not really questions. The third time she had paused, placed her hands flat on the table in front of her and said, "Mr. Bricker, I understand you have concerns. I'd like to address each one. Could I finish the section first and then give them the time they deserve?" The room had gone very still. Bricker had nodded slowly. She had finished her presentation. Every recommendation she had made that day was implemented within 18 months. She thought about her mother every time she did something like that. Not consciously. It was more like a reflex, like reaching for a tool you know is there without looking. She met a man named David in her late 20s. They married when she was 32 in a small ceremony in Della's apartment complex courtyard with lights strung between the railings and her mother's potato salad on every table. Curtis walked her down the makeshift aisle and cried the whole way, which made Renee laugh so hard the photographer caught it, and that photograph hung in their hallway for years after. She rose. That is the simple version. The longer version involves more Tuesday nights at the office than any single person should spend, more rooms where she was the only one who looked like her, more careful conversations about whether something was being heard or just acknowledged. The longer version involves a night she called her mother from a parking garage because she needed to hear a steady voice, and Della said, "Baby, you already know the answer. You're just tired." The longer version is the life inside the trajectory, and it matters because it is the record of what it actually costs to get somewhere the world told you you were going nowhere. By the time Renee was 37, she was the chief operating officer of a regional financial services firm called Meridian Group. She had 48 people reporting to her and a reputation inside the industry for being the person you called when something had gone sideways and you needed it unsideways before the quarter closed. She was known for two things. She was thorough and she was fair. People who had worked for her defended her with the particular loyalty that comes not from admiration, but from trust, from the experience of having been treated as someone whose thinking mattered. The January before the acquisition, she had dinner with her mother at the kitchen table of the apartment Della still kept on the boulevard, the same apartment from childhood, though the wallpaper in the hall was different now and the radiators had finally been replaced. Della made chicken and rice, and they ate at the table where Renee had once studied by lamplight while Curtis read the sports pages nearby. The table was the same table, the same 4 chairs. Della asked about work, as she always did, wanting specifics, never content with fine. Renee talked about the current integration project and the team dynamics, and a particular staffing decision she was weighing. Della listened with the focused attention of a woman who had been listening to things that mattered for 64 years. "This person you're deciding about," Della said, "do they do their job?" "Well enough. The question is leadership ability." "And you're asking yourself whether they have it or whether they can grow it?" Renee looked at her mother. "Yes." "Give them a harder assignment," Della said. "You'll know in 90 days. It was advice a consultant would have charged $8,000 to give. Renee followed it, as she usually followed her mother's advice because in 38 years she had not found a better source. After dinner, while they were washing dishes, Della said, without particular ceremony, "I'm proud of you." She said it in the same voice she used for everything, level and warm, and went back to rinsing the pot, and Renee stood with a dish towel in her hands and pressed the words somewhere deep and kept them. On the drive home that night, she had thought about her mother at 20, standing at a different sink in a different kitchen, holding together a life that required her best self every day and gave her no particular credit for it. She had thought about how much of what she knew about work, about people, about endurance and fairness, had come from watching a woman who cleaned other people's houses with the same care she gave her own. That was the education that wasn't on any transcript. That was the credential no one had awarded and no one could revoke. She didn't often think about him. The memory of that kitchen lived in her the way old injuries live in the body, not constantly painful, but present under pressure, a place where the tissue was different. She knew, in the vague way you know things you haven't chased down, that he had spent his career in corporate real estate and property management, that he ran some version of his family's business, that he was the kind of man who showed up in the business pages when he wanted to and disappeared when things got complicated. She did not go looking for him. She did not need to. The thing about trajectories is that the world is smaller than it looks. In the winter of the year she turned 38, Meridian Group acquired a struggling property management firm called Voss Capital Partners. She was not involved in the initial due diligence. That was handled by the acquisitions team. She came into the integration process in the fourth week, as she always did, to assess the operational structure of the absorbed firm and determine what could be retained and what needed restructuring. Her assistant printed the senior leadership roster for the acquired firm and left it on her desk with the other briefing materials. She read it on the train home. She saw his name before she saw his title, Harlan J. Voss, Chief Executive Officer. She sat with that for 3 stops. The train went underground, the overhead lights flickered once, and the car went briefly darker and then returned to itself, and she sat with the roster in her hands and read the name again as if checking whether it would change. It didn't. She thought about a kitchen in October. She thought about her mother's shoulder blades going rigid under a uniform shirt and then slowly releasing, the way a person absorbs a blow that they have no recourse for. She thought about walking home from the bus stop that afternoon, her mother not speaking, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was nowhere to put it. She thought about the way Della had cooked dinner that evening with the same precision and care she brought to everything, as if the day had been ordinary. As if ordinary were the only available response to a cruelty you couldn't answer. She thought about what it had cost her mother to stay. 6 more years after that Thursday, Della had continued to clean that house. She had needed the work, and the work was available, and she had done it, and Renee had understood for the first time, sitting in the train with the roster in her hands, what that had required of her mother. Not just the labour, the daily decision to return to a place where you had been told through your child that you were nothing. The daily decision to be larger than the space that was given to you. She put the briefing packet in her bag and looked at her reflection in the dark window of the train, and then, after a moment, she smiled. Not a smile of satisfaction, not the smile of a woman savouring a reversal. Something quieter than that. The smile of a person who has been carrying a stone for 29 years and has just found the place it was always meant to be set down. The integration meeting was held on a Tuesday morning in one of Meridian's glass-walled conference rooms on the 14th floor, the city spread out flat and grey behind the windows. Renee arrived first, as she always did, set her materials out in order, and was reviewing the operational summary when her assistant brought in the Voss Capital team at 9 o'clock. There were 5 of them. An operations director who looked exhausted and watchful in the way of people who have been through a difficult negotiation, a CFO who had brought too many folders, a legal representative who sat near the door, a younger analyst who seemed to be there mostly to take notes, and then Harlan, who walked in third. He was larger than she remembered and somehow smaller at the same time, the way the houses of childhood always recalibrate when you see them as an adult. He had a portfolio tucked under one arm and a company pin on his lapel, and the practiced ease of a man who had spent 40 years being the authority in every room he entered. He wore his suit the way men who once filled suits continue to wear them, with confidence in a version of themselves that the body no longer quite delivers. He did not look at her directly when he came in. He looked at the table, at the windows, at the seat being offered to him, performing the calm of a man who had rehearsed it. She did not introduce herself immediately. She let the room settle. She let the coffee be poured and the materials be distributed. She let the 5 members of the Voss Capital team orient themselves to the space, to each other, to the people already seated at the table from the Meridian side. She let him settle his portfolio and uncap his pen and look at the view with the expression of a man deciding how much he would cooperate. She had seen that expression before on men his age and type, and she had learned that the best response to it was not to hurry. Then she said her name and her title, and she watched his eyes find her face for the first time, and move across her features in that same slow survey she remembered from childhood, the one that started at your shoes. She held his gaze without hurrying it. He got to her face, and something shifted behind his eyes. Not recognition, not yet. Something prior to recognition. A faint wrongness he couldn't place, like a familiar melody played in the wrong key. He looked away first. She continued as though nothing had happened. She had done this before. She laid out the integration timeline, the operational benchmarks, the staffing evaluation process. She was precise, and she was fair, and she was completely at ease, because this was her room, and the work was what she could control. She asked questions of the Voss Capital team and took their answers seriously, which she could see surprised some of them. She was not there to perform a reversal. She was there to do a job. The recognition came 20 minutes in. She'd been explaining the reporting structure for the combined operations when Harlan leaned forward slightly and said, in the voice of a man who had found the wrongness he'd been looking for, "I'm sorry, Renee Watkins." He said it as if he were reading a name off a wall that he'd expected to read differently. "You wouldn't happen to be related to Della Watkins?" The room was quiet. Two of her colleagues on the Meridian side knew to stay still. She looked at him directly. She gave him the full weight of her attention, which was considerable, and she said, "She's my mother." He processed that for a long moment. She watched him process it. She watched him move back through time the same way she had on the train, reordering things, finding the kitchen, finding the October light, finding a child at a table with a library book, and she could see the moment he found it because the colour shifted in his face. The practiced ease had gone somewhere. What replaced it was the face of a man confronting the arithmetic of his own choices, which he had apparently been allowed for a long time to avoid doing. She did not help him with what he was feeling. That was not her job, and the job was the only thing she had ever needed to make speak. She said, "Shall we continue with the integration timeline?" And she continued. She did not let him off the hook, and she did not tighten it. She treated him the way she treated every leader who came into Meridian through an acquisition, with the professional evaluation that his role now required. She assessed what he brought and what he didn't, and she was honest about both, because that was the deal, and she honoured it, because her mother had taught her by example that the way you move through the world when people are watching is the same way you move through it when they aren't. After the meeting, he waited while the others filed out. She was gathering her materials when he spoke. "I owe you an apology." She looked up. He was standing by the window with his portfolio under his arm and something naked in his face that she hadn't seen there before. He was not a small man, physically, but he looked smaller than he had at 9 o'clock. "I said something to you once," he said. "When you were young, I said it to your mother, but you heard it, and I've thought about it over the years." She waited. She was good at waiting. "I was wrong," he said. "I was profoundly wrong, and I knew it was unkind even when I said it, and I said it anyway." He paused, and in the pause was the weight of what a person carries when they have known for a long time that they owed a debt and did not know how to offer it. "I'd like you to know that." She held his gaze for a moment. She thought about her mother pressing both hands flat on the kitchen table the night the scholarship letter came. She thought about Curtis walking her down an aisle strung with lights. She thought about a pot being rinsed and 2 words spoken without ceremony. "I appreciate that," she said. And she meant it, because she was not in the business of withholding things that were genuinely owed. "Your mother," he said, and then he stopped, as if he wasn't sure what came next. "She's well," Renee said. "She's retired. She tends a garden now. She's very good at it." He nodded. He looked out the window at the grey city. "She was the finest person who ever worked for my family," he said. "I don't think I ever told her that." "No," Renee said simply. "You didn't." She picked up her portfolio and walked to the door. She paused, not for effect, but because there was something honest she wanted to say, and she had never believed in leaving honest things unsaid when they were also kind. "The apology matters," she told him. "More than you know." She walked out. Her heels made a clean sound on the polished floor of the corridor, and the glass door of the conference room swung closed behind her. She stood at the floor-to-ceiling window at the end of the hall for a moment, looking out at the city. 14 stories below, people moved on the sidewalks in their coats, going where they were going, unaware of anything in particular. She watched them for a moment and thought about nothing, and then about something, and then came back to the work she had to do next. She called her mother that evening from her car in the parking structure. It had become a habit of years, those calls from the car before she drove home, the quiet tunnel between her working self and the woman who walked into her own kitchen and set her bag down and breathed. Della answered on the second ring. Renee told her what had happened. Not with drama. She told it the way her mother had taught her to tell hard things, plainly, with room for the other person to sit with it. There was silence on Della's end for a moment. "Well," her mother said. "Well," Renee agreed. "Did you handle yourself well?" "I think so." "Did you treat him fairly?" "Yes." "Good," Della said. "That's all there is then. That's all you can do." Renee leaned her head back against the seat. Through the concrete slats of the garage she could see a narrow strip of evening sky, pink at the edges where the sun was finishing. "He said you were the finest person who ever worked for his family," she said. He said he never told you. Another silence. Men like that, Della said, and then she let the sentence go unfinished, which was its own kind of statement. I know, Mama. They don't know what they're looking at, Della said. They look right at something precious and they see what they expect to see. That's their poverty. Don't carry it for them. Renee sat with that for a moment. Outside, someone else's headlights swept across the concrete above her. How's the garden? She said. The tomatoes are finally coming in, Della said, and her voice lifted the way it always did when she talked about the garden, a warmth that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with a woman who had, at 64, finally found a thing that was entirely hers. Big as my fist, some of them. I put them in the sun every morning on the rail. Save me some. I always do. She drove home through the evening city, through the lights coming on in the windows of the buildings and the people moving on the sidewalks below, all of them in the middle of their own unfinished stories. She thought about a girl on a bus with a stone in her chest. She thought about how long a person can carry something and what it means when the carrying is finally done. David was in the kitchen when she got home and the smell of dinner was warm in the air, and when she set her bag down by the door and he looked up, she was already almost all the way to being all right. She thought about the integration meeting, about a question of restructuring that still needed her attention, and she let it live at the edge of her mind without letting it into the room. That was a skill she had spent years building and still sometimes lost. Tonight, she did not lose it. She sat down at the table and David set a plate in front of her and she picked up her fork. How was your day? He said. Long, she said, and strange, and good. He waited because he knew her and she told him the shape of it over dinner. Not every detail, the shape. He listened the way he always listened, without interrupting, without offering the thing he thought she should feel about it. When she finished, he reached across the table and put his hand over hers. You know what the thing is, he said. She looked at him. The thing is, he said, your mother's daughter went to that meeting today, and she handled it like your mother's daughter handles things. She had thought about this on the drive home. She had thought about it in the parking structure, and at the window on the 14th floor, and for a moment in the middle of the integration meeting itself, when she had looked at his hands on the conference table and recognized them and let the recognition pass through her without stopping. He saw that, David said. That's why it landed the way it did. He didn't just see you. He saw what he was measuring you against in that kitchen all those years ago, and he understood what the measure said about him. I think he did, she said. She'd be proud of you, David said. I'm going to call her on Sunday and take her to lunch, Renee said. Somewhere nice, somewhere with tablecloths. She'll complain about the prices, and then she'll order dessert. He laughed, and she laughed, and the dinner got cold while they talked, which was fine. There is a particular kind of satisfaction that has nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with completion. Renee Watkins knew that satisfaction now. Not as a theory, but as a physical thing, the way you know the weather. She had not set out to be anyone's lesson. She had set out to be competent and honest and fair, the way Della had been all those years in other people's houses, and she had let the work speak. And it had spoken clearly enough that the room had rearranged itself around the fact of her without her having to say a word about it. That was the inheritance. Not the corner office and not the title and not the integration meeting and not even his apology, though she was glad for it the way you're glad for rain after a long, dry spell. The inheritance was the understanding that doing right when no one is watching is not wasted. It accumulates. It becomes the architecture of who you are, and who you are will eventually walk into a room and speak for itself. Della had known this. Della had lived it in every kitchen she'd ever cleaned. In every Thursday she'd shown up with her caddy of supplies and her good morning ready. In every moment she'd absorbed a cruelty in silence and gone back to work because the alternative was to become smaller than the cruelty wanted her to be. She had chosen not to be smaller. She had gone home and raised a daughter, and she had done it with the same steady patience she brought to everything, and the daughter had become someone worth reckoning with. The tomatoes came in that September. Renee drove out on a Sunday morning with David, and they ate lunch on Della's small balcony among the pots and the climbing vines, and the balcony was crowded with things Della had planted and learned the names of. Basil at the rail, one pepper plant training up a bamboo stake, marigolds in a terracotta pot she'd had since before Renee was born. The city was below them, and the sky was the particular blue of early September, clear and close, and Della brought out the tomatoes sliced thick on a plate with salt and olive oil and nothing else, and they ate them in the sun. Curtis sat at the edge of the table with the newspaper open across his lap and made comments about things no one else had opinions on, and Della scolded him in the fond, worn way of long partnership, and he grinned at Renee behind her mother's back the way he always had, since she was small, and Renee grinned back. They talked about ordinary things. Della's neighbour who had recently gotten a dog, a cousin's graduation. The afternoon light shifting across the railing and the sounds of the boulevard below, traffic and someone's music and the periodic sound of the bus route Curtis used to drive, still running on its old schedule. At some point, a wind came up and moved through the basil and the marigolds, and Della put a hand over her paper napkin to stop it from going, and Curtis said something that made Della laugh, a real laugh, full and easy, the laugh of a woman who had worked very hard and had, at this point in her life, earned the afternoon. At one point, in a lull, Della looked up from her plate. She looked at Renee for a moment with those warm, steady eyes behind the wire-rimmed glasses, and she said, "You're well?" "I'm well, Mama." "At work, things are settled?" "Getting there." Della nodded. She picked up a slice of tomato and ate it slowly and looked at the sky in the easy way of a woman who had stopped hurrying. "Good," she said. "That's good." That was all she said. She did not ask about any of it. She did not need to. Renee had told her what there was to tell, and Della had put it where she put things that were finished, in the past, where they were no longer heavy. Renee understood the whole of what her mother was asking, and the whole of what she was saying, and the weight of it was something she carried the rest of the afternoon. Not like a burden, but like something you carry when it is precious, and you do not want to set it down. She and David drove home in the late afternoon. The city came up around them in the ordinary way, exits and overpasses, and the light going long and amber in the sky. She had her feet on the dashboard and her window cracked and the radio on low, something old and slow, and David drove the way he always drove, easy and unhurried, and she looked at the passing buildings and thought about all the people in them, all the women doing the patient, invisible thing in the hope that it added up to something. It adds up. That is the only thing she knew with certainty, the only thing she would offer anyone who wanted it. It adds up. You keep doing the patient, faithful thing. You keep choosing not to let the cruelty make you smaller. You keep showing up with your caddy and your good morning and your library book and your refusal, and the world may not notice for a very long time, and then one day it does. And when it does, the work speaks. Not you, the work. If you've been carrying something like that, if someone's words have ever lived in you the way that October Kitchen lived in Renee, the way a voice can settle into the body and stay there through 2 decades of evidence that it was wrong, you already know the rest of what I would say. You know it in the place where the tissue is different, where the old injury lives. You know the work is the inheritance. So keep working. Across the balcony, in the warm September afternoon, a woman in wire-rimmed glasses reached for the last slice of tomato and smiled at nothing in particular, at the sun on the railing, at the marigolds, at the good ordinary afternoon of her own life. Her daughter, on the drive home, held the image of that smile in her mind for a long time. It was exactly the image she had been building towards since she was 9 years old. She had just not known then that this was what the stone was for.